Hey, personal health and wellness. Welcome to Fitness Concepts. I'm really excited we're here. I'm going to be working today from the resource of health.gov and their physical activity guidelines. This is a wonderful resource which I've linked into the module here for you to do a one-click to get to. So let's talk first about benefits. Benefits are things that are going to come that are good from our physical activity, right? And so what we see is even in kids, some really impressive benefits from bone health all the way into cognitive function. A reduced risk of cancer across many sites in our body. Brain health, brain health that includes possible reduction in anxiety, depression. That speaks to me specifically. I love seeing how my mood changes just from participating in some physical activity like a good run or a weight room session. I just immediately have a better mood about me. Pregnant women, we're going to talk very specifically about what you should be doing if you are pregnant and how much activity tolerance is out there for you, but also looking at older adults. And I realize that I'm kind of standing in the way of this right here, but basically what we're seeing there is a risk reduction in fall rates. After you turn 65, your greatest risk is falling, not cardiovascular disease as far as death is concerned. And so we want to reduce that. And then people with chronic medical conditions, how much activity should they be participating in? We also see benefits that are lower risk all-cause mortality. That means everything out there that causes you to die goes down when you are physically active. Your risk of dying from cardiovascular disease or even having cardiovascular disease going down, hypertension going down, type 2 diabetes going down, adverse blood lipid profile. What does that mean? That means fats that are in your blood, they're going down. Risk of cancer is going down. Dementia and Alzheimer's going down. Anxiety and depression going down. Falls and fall related injuries are going down. All these things are decreasing just because we're getting active. And then take a look over here on this column. You're going to reduce your weight gain or your weight loss. What does that mean? Well, typically we think weight loss is a good thing, but as you get older, you lose weight because you're losing muscle, and that's not a good thing because that only contributes to more falls. Your quality of life is just going to increase, and I could probably teach an entire lesson just on that, and so I have to be very careful not to spend too much time there, but you're going to improve your sleep as well. Listen, speaking my love language, how do I improve my sleep, right? You guys are already aware that that's something that I'm looking at. My bone health is going to get better. We're going to talk about that. And then just improved physical function. So lots of very unique things that are going on just because we're getting physically active. When we talk about mortality, we want to talk about ways to live longer, have a longer and more quality of life. And the more sitting we do, the more likely it is that we're going to die early. But the more we move, the more likely it is that we're going to live longer, but then also have a better quality of life. I know that many of you are saying, listen, I've never done that before, and it's probably not a good time to start. I have to disagree. Right now is a great time to start. Any time to start is a great time to start. Next, we have to understand some things about the terminology that goes on with fitness. And there's three simple terms. Number one, physical fitness is our ability to perform moderate to vigorous amounts of activity throughout the day and not be too tired without undue fatigue, right? That means, can you do yard work? Can you do housework? Can you go on a run? Can you go to the gym? Can you chase your kids around and not just be completely wiped out? That's your level of fitness. And so what we want to do is we want to improve that. The next thing is, what is a physical activity? Well, that's something that actually your body is going to do, and it's going to use energy to do it. Later, we're going to talk about a basal metabolic rate. And physical activity is anything that your body does to use energy above basal level or base level. And so what is base level? That means you woke up this morning, you never got out of bed, you use the bathroom all over yourself and basically just stay there all day. That's base level, but you're still using energy. Well, if you do anything that's above that, that's physical activity. And so that's really important to understand that we're going to stay on track with this concept. Number 3 is exercise. What is exercise? Well, exercise is structured, it's planned, it has a point to it. And that's really important to understand is that you may say, listen, I walk, that's my physical activity, but is it really your physical activity? Is that something that you're doing that's planned and structured? Do you say, I'm going out these 3 nights a week and I'm going to walk for this many minutes per time, and that's going to get me this specific goal met? Because that's what exercise is. If you say, I walk regularly, but you really don't walk regularly, like 3 to 5 times a week, then you're really not exercising. And so we're going to kind of look at that structure soon. We need to understand body composition and how that fits together with the concepts that we're going to present to you in this class. Body composition is dictated by this bigger circle out here, by the things that you do and what things can you do. And so we're looking at it from aerobic conditioning, which is walking, running, jogging, cycling, possibly swimming, and then a little bit of weightlifting for muscle strength and endurance, and then a little bit of flexibility training so that you continue to keep your body moving in its available ranges of motion. Next, we need to talk about principles. Principles are fundamental truths. These are things that must happen. You're a college student. You must go to class. You must open a textbook. You must study. You must read. You must research to be successful in your college career. Well, in your fitness life, you need to obey certain principles, fundamental truths, to make sure that you meet those goals. The number one thing that you have to do is you have to overload, which means you have to do more than what it's normal or accustomed to. And by that, I mean, if you're used to walking 1 mile a day and it's pretty easy, then you're gonna have to up it, maybe 3 or 4 miles to get a training effect out of that exercise. If you're able to lift a certain weight pretty easily for 15 reps, it's time for you to up that weight so that you get an overload. Another principle is progression. Eventually, you need to increase certain facets about your exercise, frequency being number one. Sometimes we need to up it from doing 3 days a week to 5 days a week. Sometimes we need to change our intensity. How hard are we working out? We talked about that in the overload, and that's a perfect example of when we need to progress. Time, sometimes, we need to think about how much time are we actually out there working. If you're walking for 10 minutes and it becomes pretty easy, well, again, that's an intensity thing. Let's take our time up. Let's make it 20 or 30 minutes and let's see how we do. Sometimes this gets very specific to the activity, and so I don't want to tell you just to immediately add 10 minutes onto your daily walk if you're not ready for that yet, but for some folks, that's very appropriate to say that. The final thing is we look at type. How do we progress our type of activity? I would tell you that it's not wise for a beginning exercise enthusiast to start in CrossFit. Maybe you want to build some strength first, but maybe you have a good CrossFit coach who knows how to modify and can help you begin there. It all depends on where you're at, what resources you have, and then what goals and what you're willing to do. Specificity is physiological changes that are dependent on the type of activity. This one is really kind of more geared to saying when you have a specific goal in mind, you need to train for that. A good example is if I want to become a runner, then I know I need to run. I can't just walk all the time and expect to become a runner overnight. I need to interpret that some of my training needs to be specific to my goal. And so if I'm going to be a runner, then I need to add in a little bit of running every once in a while until all of a sudden I'm running all the time. And Then I find that running becomes pretty easy. And then I can run a little faster or a little longer or a little further. And I'm hitting my goal of, or rather my principle of progression as well as overload. Reversibility happens. That means if you don't use it, you lose it. And that means that all the gains that could have happened are transient. They go away because we did not do the things to maintain our fitness. Rest and recovery is equally important. I'm going to talk about periodization in just a moment. And that's a very important part of periodization. We need rest because that's when those adaptations that we want to happen are going to occur. They are very great in number during the times that we rest. The SAID principle, specific adaptations to impose demands, that means that you need to do certain things to get certain adaptations. If you don't work hard enough, you don't employ the overload and progression principle enough, you're not going to adapt to what your goals are. And so many times what we see is people who are out there exercising and they're upset because they haven't been able to walk a mile in 15 minutes, but yet they never quite have employed the overload and progression principle quite enough to get adaptations in their muscles and in their heart and in their lungs to actually get that time down. They're kind of strolling leisurely. They never have quite put the time in. We'll look at those very specifically as we go through. Um, we are now looking at what is an appropriate volume for adults. And what the health.gov website tells us is that adults need 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity aerobic activity, and then they need 2 days a week where they're focused on strength training or muscle performance activities. That's going to the gym and lifting some weights or going to CrossFit. This 150 minutes, though, I want to say this. It can be divided up, and we'll look very specifically on what a frequency should be in our next module. But if you kind of just do the math and you said, okay, 150 minutes, if I were going to do that 5 times a week, that would mean I would have to participate in 30 minutes a day. And that's just how simple that is. And that's right on with exactly what we need to be looking at. Another thing here is children. How often and how much should they participate in? Well, it just says 60 minutes a day. They need to be active for 60 minutes a day. That's typically play, though. We're not asking kids to go in and lift weights, especially if they're not skeletally mature enough to do so. It's just part of their day, though. And we do that across the day. If there's 24 hours in a day, 8 of those are spent sleeping, probably 10 of those are spent sleeping. Then 60 minutes of that 1 hour per day, we need to get our kids active. And that's why physical education in school systems is so important. Another aspect of children is, what about the preschool ages, 3 to 5? Well, we just want to disperse a active day across their day. And it says in my second bullet here that adult caregivers should encourage active play that includes a variety of different activity types. We want to get them outside. We want to get them running, playing tag, playing ball, playing chase, whatever it is. But we want to do that throughout their day because, again, that's going to help with bone. That's going to help with development of their brains. That's going to get them out and burn up some of that energy that they have anyways. And kids are full of that. Man, I wish I could just like tap into that in my own life. But we want to get them out across the day. It doesn't have to be 60 consecutive minutes. It just needs to be across the day. And then we need to talk about our females out there, especially those who are pregnant and expectant mothers, and then maybe even you just had a baby. What is it that you need to do? Well, you need to look at 150 minutes a week of moderate intensity aerobic activity. This is the same thing that we would recommend to an adult who doesn't have a kid or doesn't have or isn't going through pregnancy. And what we find is that as women participate in this, we get better babies coming from this. We see lots of improved outcomes on both the delivery, but also the baby coming out, and all these really good things that are happening there. It says women who habitually engage in vigorous intensity aerobic activity, or who are physically active before their pregnancy, can continue those activities during their pregnancy. Now, if you have specific problems, special considerations that are occurring during your pregnancy, maybe you have some placenta issues or just some things where your healthcare provider has said you need to be on bed rest, this is not you. This is talking about a woman who has a very normal, healthy pregnancy. What can she do? She can participate in 150 minutes per week in physical activity. Women who are pregnant should be under the care of a healthcare provider the whole time. And this is kind of just a small snippet here, but this is personal health. If you're pregnant, please make sure that you have your healthcare advocate lined up to monitor your pregnancy throughout that. Your pregnancy health is very important. And if you need resources on which to tap into, please contact me personally, and I will help you in any way that I can in connecting you to the right resources for your care. Next, we have to talk about adults who have chronic medical conditions. How much exercise should they participate in? You're talking about the type 2 diabetics, you're talking about cancer, you're talking about chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, you're talking about osteoarthritis, osteoporosis, different types of diseases that affect a person. How active can they be? That's going to really depend on what their level of function is, but if their level of function is of that allows, then they need to participate in 150 minutes per week. You're starting to see the trend, right? 150 minutes per week, maybe up to 300 minutes a week of more moderate or lighter activity. But they should definitely be participating because they're the ones who are sick and they can get a lot of benefits. Listen, I work in physical therapy, right? And I see a lot of these patients, and I know what can happen if you take a person who's very, very sick and you exercise them and see what functions can come out of that. But again, it has to be appropriate. It doesn't need to be an all-out war against this disease, trying to do it with activity. It still needs to be appropriate. And that's where having the right people guiding you through that process helps. You find the physical therapist, you find the athletic trainer, you find the personal trainer. You talk to those people, and you always ask them, listen, if you don't know how to do this, would you point me to a person who does? Because that's where progress will happen, is when you connect to the right people who can coach you through that. So we're looking at this next thing called a fit formula, and this is something that we use to help a person dictate how much exercise they should do. F is simply how often should you do it. 3 days, 5 days, 7 days a week. Intensity is how hard. How do we know how hard to do it? There's a minimal stimulus threshold, and we're going to talk about those specific as we get into the next two modules. Time, how long should I spend doing whatever activity it is I want to do? Do I ride my bike for 20 minutes? Do I ride my bike for an hour and 50 minutes at one time? What's appropriate for you is the most important thing that dictates that, but we also have some variables in the next two modules that we'll address that are specific to the type, which is the final thing here, that will help us understand what it is that we need to do. The next thing that I want to do is I want to spend just a little bit more time on this intensity component, the how hard, right? And I need you to understand that as we go forward, frequency, how often we do something, intensity, how hard we do something, and time, how long we're going to do it, all are intertwined. And as one goes up, the other kind of has to go down. And that's very important to understand that inverse relationship there. One thing that we can look at here is intensity in as far as some examples of how hard something should be. And we look at this from something called METs, or metabolic equivalents. METs are simply a metric that we use to measure how hard something is. And what you can see here is we have METs that are light, that are moderate, and that are vigorous. And so sleeping to walking 2.5 miles an hour is less than 3 METs. So what you're finding here is this is light activity. But again, even sleeping requires a energy expenditure. And so we have to measure that somewhere. And that's very important to understand, is that everything you do requires energy. Well, where do you get this energy from? Well, you get that energy from food. Your body doesn't just create energy um, without having something to base it off of. It has to take energy in and then convert it. Well, this is how that process happens. And then, or we're going to talk about how that process happens, but we're going to look at very specifically how much energy is used. Moderate intensity activities, that's bicycling, very light effort, all the way up to bicycling with 100 watts. And watts are another metric that we use, but you need to know that some of these things like watts are only identified on a modality like a bike or like a treadmill or an elliptical where we can measure. It's very difficult to use watts when you're lifting weights and understand what that means. But take a look here. Walking at 3.4 miles per hour, that's a pretty brisk walk. It's just about a 20-minute a mile walk, but it's still pretty brisk. And so that gets you into a moderate intensity. A vigorous intensity is something a little more vigorous than a walk at 3.4 miles an hour, though that's a run. And so what we see there is also calisthenics, such as push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups, jumping jacks, body weight activities. They're more vigorous. And that's where you start to get into 7+ METs. So if you need some more information, I have a link there for how to understand METs in the next video down. Now, I do want to talk about this as well. Rate of perceived exertion. This is you saying this is how hard I'm working out. So it's kind of subjective, but this guy named Borg came in and said, listen, we need to make this a little more objective. And he understood that a normal resting heart rate started at around 60. So he placed his 14-point scale at 6. And he said, I'm going to add 14 to that to get to 2 or to 20, which kind of made sense in his mind that if you go from 60 to 200, that's a good parameter base on how your heart rate should react to your effort. Well, if you have that 60 as your resting heart rate, this works. But if you don't, then you just kind of have to go over and look at what the perceived exertion is. So the perceived exertion for very light weight or very light work is around a 6, but that's very, very light. What I want you to kind of look at here is somewhat hard. 13. That's kind of where we need to be when we exercise. That's our minimal stimulus threshold. And we look at that and we know that we're going to get benefits when we're working at somewhat hard. And so you can do an activity like a walk, like a run, like weightlifting, and you can say, yeah, that's somewhat hard. Well, if it's somewhat hard, you're probably right in the sweet spot. And the sweet spot is that minimal stimulus threshold. That's where if gains are desired, you have to do a minimal threshold of work so that you can get them. Kind of sounds like overload, kind of sounds like progression, kind of sounds like specificity, right? And so that's where those principles come into play, but more at a functional level, like how much can I actually use of this? Your type of exercise will tell you what metric to use. And we'll get into that very specifically in the next 2 modules, but here's just a sneak peek. If you are looking to get aerobic conditioning, you're looking to improve your cardiovascular health, what you're going to need to do is work at about 75% of your max heart rate. That means you use a equation that takes into account your age, and then you identify what your max heart rate is, and you work at about 75% of that. You're going to get cardiovascular effects out of that, positive benefits out of that. And that's how that works. Another thing that we need to look at is periodization. Periodization is based off of the idea that you're not going to spend all year long working really, really hard. You're going to have to spend some time down. You could look at this from a microcycle level, like throughout my week, I'm going to have days where I'm not working out. You can look at it from a macro cycle level, where you may have a period of time where your workouts change, where you're not working out as hard, or you're not spending as much time doing whatever physical activity you typically do. Maybe you're cross training and doing something else. A really good example of this is for me, I do not run marathon train basically year round. I do run a little bit higher levels, especially in the winter when the weather's more cooperative. But in the summer, I like to ride a bike. I like to swim. I like to do things that are a little easier on my body, a little less impact, but also they accommodate that weather pattern of heat better. And so that's just kind of how I keep things going and stay consistent. But you have three phases. One, your preparatory phase. That's where volume and intensity are pretty low. You're not keeping things really high together at that. You're kind of waiting to develop a base here where your volume is going to go up. That's how much work you're doing. But again, as your volume goes up, your intensity kind of stays down. Where we're looking at there is that inverse relationship. But then you kind of develop your base, and then you want to go ahead and build. And you want to build your fitness on top of that base. Well, that's when you bring intensity and volume up together. And then when you're ready to compete, say race or participate in a competition, or maybe even play a Friday night football, that's when you're going to peak out. And when you peak out, notice how intensity comes up and volume goes down. And that's very true about a lot of training regimens. And so if you are going to identify your own training regimen, especially from a macro cycle, looking at the whole year, you would want to plan it out based on these three phases: preparatory, competitive, and then transitional being your rest phase. When are you incorporating that rest or downtime in? Next, we want to look at the concept of delayed onset muscle soreness, or DOMS, D-O-M-S. It's completely normal to be sore after a workout. It's completely normal to say, I can't sit down. I just kind of have to fall into a chair because my legs are broke off from doing squats. Hey, that's great. And I want to tell you and encourage you, it's not going to last long. It may last 3, 4, 6, 7 days, but it's not going to continue to be that hard because you're going to make adaptations to those imposed demands. That's the said principle at work. It is going to peak out somewhere around 24 to 72 hours. It's also going to be relieved by doing more work, but just at a softer, gentler level. We don't want to go back and try to do the same amount of work and expect that that's a good thing. We'll get into very specifics on how much rest you should use in the aerobic as well as the strength and endurance talks. But you need to understand that a little light activity is pretty good for that soreness and helps to kind of relieve it. Safety has to be our number one goal. We always have to be safe so that we can continue to do the exercise that we want to do. Guidelines for this are: number one, understand your risks and yet be confident that physical activity is safe for almost everyone. But you want to obey the rules. You want to look at the policies. If there's a sign that says this trail is off limits, you don't take your bike down it. Don't ask me how I know that because I don't want to tell that story. Number two, choose and do types of physical activity that are appropriate for your fitness. Listen, if you've only been running a couple or 3 days a week, don't sign up for a marathon next weekend. It's just not in your wheelhouse to participate in that kind of event. But if you have ran for 3 or 5 days a week to 7 days a week, and you've been doing that for several months, maybe you sign up for a marathon 4 months from now, and you develop a plan, and you carry out that plan, and you train, and you make an appropriate amount of volume into that, you can participate in a marathon. but you need to be appropriate to your physical level of fitness that you currently have. Increasing gradually over time. I like to recommend a 10% rule. You'll see that coming very, very soon. But I like to say, let's use a 10% rule. And let's use that very carefully. Like, we're not going to increase our volume over 10% every week. Another thing is always look for the right gear to protect yourself, the right shoes, the right clothes. It doesn't have to have a swoosh or an X on it to be the right kind of stuff. It can come from Walmart. It can come from Dollar General. It just needs to be safe. Another thing, be under the care of a healthcare provider. Talk to them about what it is that you're doing every time that you see them so that they understand and can make recommendations based off of what they're seeing about you and your physical health and certain metrics that they will use. I want to also include in this talk how to do a proper warm-up. Number one is you should always warm up. Your body is not ready to go right into heavy exercise from a homeostatic position. So what does that look like? That means for 5 to 10 minutes, you do things that emulate whatever activity you're going to do. Maybe if you're going to go on a bike ride, you spend just 5 or 10 minutes of easy bike riding just to get ready for maybe 30 to 45 minutes of hard bike riding. And that's a safe thing to do because that warms up the body. It should be physiological in that you get within about 20 to 30 beats per minute of your target heart rate. Again, we'll cover that in the next module and you'll see specifically how to do that. Your cool down. Well, that's something that a lot of people don't do because they kind of think it's not worth it. But this is a great opportunity for you to return your heart rate back to close to normal or resting. And at the same time, you can incorporate some good flexibility training in, which you should be doing 2 to 3 days a week anyways. We'll address that in a later module as well. You need to learn your skills. If you want to be rich, you study the habits of a rich person. If you want to learn how to ride a bike, you study the habits of a person who's been riding a bike for a long time. If you want to learn how to run or lift weights, you study the habits of people who already know that, who've already been down that path. I promise you that if you ask most people to show you how to do something in exercise, you're going to get someone who's overzealous and they're going to show you everything they know and they're going to try to teach you because they want you to enjoy it the way they have. If you run into a person who doesn't have that zeal, who doesn't share your positive attitude towards that activity, then you dump them and you find someone who will, or you contact me directly and let me help you find someone. Your fuel has to be appropriate. Make sure, and we're going to talk very specifically about food very soon. Make sure that you look at your food and you identify what foods work for you in each of your activities. Gear, don't go out on the cheap. Don't buy cheap running shoes. Make sure you invest in a shoe or any type of equipment that is going to help you be in this for the long term and enjoy it. So we're going to go right now. We're going to take our quiz and we're going to go through some of the things that we've talked about in this lecture and we're going to make it very specific in our quiz. I also want you to take the assignment very seriously. What was your golden nugget from this talk? You're going to have to identify one thing and identify why it was your golden nugget. What did you learn? Hopefully, even if you are physically active and you're a fitness guru, I gave you something that you can hold on to and use. I hope you enjoyed this talk. I hope you're looking forward to the rest of what we're going to do in physical activity. I'll see you very soon.